I've known my wife for 6 years and we've been married for 5. I'm 28 and she's 27. Currently my wife is pregnant and she's taken a break from her job as a police officer to have the baby. This whole situation started when a couple of a-hole police officers came to my door to threaten me. We got into a huge confronting which she initiated and I threw her out of the house. One of the officers seemed to think that just because he had a badge I should be intimidated by him. This officer used to be my wife's partner in her patrol car back when she was active in the force. They've been working together for about a year now, and my wife has been in the police force for 4 years. Ever since she started partnering with this guy about a year ago, her behavior has become strange and our marriage has been falling apart. During our argument, things got worse and she slapped me first and I threw her out of the house. Then she called him and he showed up at my door, threatening to put me in jail if I continued to provoke my wife. I've always had suspicions that there was something going on between them, and now I'm convinced of it. Let me provide some background information that led up to this incident. Back when my wife was considering becoming a police officer, she had just graduated from a community college with a degree in criminal justice. I was between jobs at that time, and we were having financial difficulties. The police department paid well, so it was an easy choice for her to join the force. She didn't plan on making it a lifelong career because of the risks involved in being a police officer. I remember one incident when she responded to a domestic dispute and tried to arrest someone, but it ended up with her getting seriously injured. I had to visit her in the hospital. What happened was she had been called to a domestic dispute involving a woman and her intoxicated boyfriend. She arrived at the guy's door thinking it might be a simple situation, as she didn't have a partner due to her partner being sick that day. She knocked, but there was no response. Then she heard a woman screaming inside the house, so she called for backup and tried to enter the house. It took her a few minutes, but she eventually managed to get inside. When she did, she found the intoxicated man was offending his wife. She pulled out her taser and tried to subdue him, but it only made him angrier. He confronted her before she could reach her firearm and they got into a struggle, with her taking the brunt of it. She managed to hold onto her tool until backup arrived and intervened. It was a terrifying experience for both of us, and it was one of those near-death situations where she could have lost her life. When I visited her in the hospital, she looked like she'd been in a car crash. Seeing her lying there in the hospital bed was one of the worst days of my life. Her face was swollen, and the doctor told us she nearly lost an eye. It was a wake-up call for both of us. I stayed by her bedside in the hospital for 2 days. Her recovery took some time, not just physically but mentally as well. She had to take paid leave for almost a month. During her recovery, we had a serious conversation about her transitioning from law enforcement to becoming a TSA agent. It wouldn't pay as much, but it would give me peace of mind knowing she was safer. You see, as a police officer, every day she walked out that door could potentially be her last. Around that time, I was close to completing my mechanic training and doing side jobs to cover our rent and utilities. After her recovery, she returned to work but was assigned to a desk job to rebuild her confidence before going back into the field. I remember in the first week of her desk job, she came home complaining about how slow it was and how she longed for adventure and action. I reminded her about what happened when she rushed into action without waiting for backup, and I assured her that she'd get used to it. My wife has this habit of talking about her work when she gets home. She goes into great detail about everyone at her workplace. I usually just let her talk because she needs to vent, and it's either me or a therapist, but we can't afford the latter. So I'm her sounding board. About 6 months into her desk job, she started going on about this guy who recently left the Marines and joined the police force. She'd complain about how cocky he was, thinking he's some kind of G.I. Joe. She spoke of him with annoyance, going on about his arrogance, disrespect, and how much she despised him. She even mentioned hearing stories of him mistreating detainees and breaking the law. My usual response was that she could blow the whistle, report him, and be protected from retaliation, or she could simply ignore it. Honestly, I thought she might be overreacting. From what she described, it seemed like she might be jealous of him. My wife has always disliked overly arrogant people. I remember how much she loathed Trump, and she couldn't stop talking about him. She even attended a women's march against him and became more liberal because of it. I've never been interested in politics, so I figured she was maybe making a big deal out of this guy, thinking he was some sort of mini Trump who'd gotten under her skin, and she was just venting her frustration. So this carried on for about a month, and then it abruptly ceased. She stopped griping about it. Initially, I felt relieved that she wasn't talking about that guy anymore. But a few weeks later, she began discussing going back to field work. I expressed my disagreement, telling her it wasn't a good idea. She dropped the subject for a short while. However, she brought it up multiple times afterward, insisting she'd only have light duties. I reminded her that light duty had landed her in the hospital before, hoping that would end the conversation. Later, she mentioned working extra shifts. While I appreciated her desire to contribute more, it struck me as odd because we weren't in dire need of money at the time. We were doing fine financially, and it was just the two of us since she didn't want kids. I did want children eventually, but I wasn't in a hurry. I began suspecting that she had returned to patrol secretly, so I tried to catch her in the act. When she told me about working overtime, I went to the police station where she was supposed to be. However, I couldn't access the office area without her noticing I was there. So I waited for her, but she didn't come out during lunchtime or when her shift should have ended. Unfortunately, my patience ran out, and I went home. When she returned from work, I confronted her about it, and she lied, claiming she was in her office. She knew they wouldn't allow me into her office area, making it impossible for me to confirm whether she was on patrol unless I waited and caught her in the act. I went to the extent of purchasing a radio scanner, something I've often seen in movies. So I got myself a police radio scanner, listened to it for 2 days, and recorded her transmissions. What surprised me the most was that this guy she had been labeling as arrogant, and even compared to Trump, is now her new partner in the patrol car. At this point, I didn't exactly suspect anything was going on between them. I was mainly concerned that she had lied to me and might end up in a dangerous situation, potentially landing in the hospital. She seemed to be channeling her inner G.I. Jane, wanting to live out the adventures from her favorite cop show. But, to me, she appeared too delicate and cute for a patrol job. Not everyone is cut out for it, and I couldn't understand how they even allowed her to do it. When she returned home that night, I confronted her about it. I reminded her that she was now partnered with her supposed adversary, Donald Trump. Her excuse was that she had no other choice, and he was the only available option. They made them patrol partners, and she claimed she had no say in the matter. She even tried to spin it positively, saying I should be happy because having someone brave enough to partner with his wife would keep her safer. I countered that she wouldn't need protection if she had stayed at her desk job or quit the police force altogether. But she brushed aside my concerns. After catching her in her lie, she began opening up about how much she enjoyed the police force now and how invigorated she felt. She expressed aspirations of becoming a detective and climbing the ranks. It was evident that someone had been influencing her with their ideas. She must have been listening and absorbing the views of her new patrol car partner. And now she was starting to sound more like him. I should have seen this as a red flag, but I chose to ignore it because I trusted my wife. I gradually noticed my wife transforming into someone unrecognizable. Her conversations changed, and the way she talked to me was no longer the same. Her work hours became erratic, and our planned quality time together was now contingent on when her patrol partner decided to work overtime. She'd sometimes abruptly alter our plans to join him on patrol. I pointed out that this wasn't the military and they weren't in a battle, so she couldn't just cancel our time together for her work partner regardless of his profession. I argued that they could easily find a replacement for him. Her response, though, drove me crazy. She said she didn't want to disappoint him. This is when my suspicions of an affair started to creep in. When I confronted her with my concerns and suggested she stop partnering with him due to my suspicion of an affair, she accused me of being insecure. She reassured me that he was married with kids and firmly stated he would never cheat on his wife. To me, this declaration implied that she had at least considered cheating with him because she was vouching for his loyalty. She brushed off my concerns, claiming that women at work were constantly hitting on him, but he remained faithful. He consistently liked all of her photos on Facebook. I mean, who does that? Especially with a married woman. I confronted her about it, and all she said was that he was just her work partner. From that point on, our marriage was in trouble. I started to resent my wife because she refused to stop working with this guy, and it seemed like she didn't care about how uncomfortable it made me feel. Even when I pressed her on it, she claimed she had stopped. But when I checked with people at her job, they confirmed that he was still her patrol partner. At some stage, she mentioned that she wanted a break from the police force to have kids, and that she'd stop taking her birth control. I didn't find it suspicious at the time, maybe because her partner had kids, and she wanted to follow suit. Plus, I wanted kids too. About a month later, she became pregnant. A little over 3 months after that, I landed a high-paying job as a field technician. Essentially, I worked for a medical equipment service company, and the pay was too good to pass up. I ended up traveling 3 days a week for work. At this point, my wife was about 4 months pregnant and taking some time off work. I found it odd that she stayed home all day without doing much, but I didn't dwell on it too much. After a 3-day business trip, I returned home one day, and my neighbor, whom I was friendly with because I had done some free car repairs for him several times before, informed me that a police officer had visited my house 3 days in a row and stayed there for hours. At that time, my wife wasn't working. She was taking some time off. So there was no legitimate reason for a police car to be parked outside our house. When my wife came home, I confronted her about it. Initially, she denied it, but when I mentioned that the neighbors had seen him, she changed her tune. She started explaining that I was away and she needed some company, insisting that it was just an innocent visit. I pointed out that she could have called any of her friends for company, so why him? She accused me of blowing this out of proportion, saying I was insecure. I countered by telling her that if she hadn't acted suspiciously, I wouldn't be feeling insecure. Then, things escalated. She slapped me twice in the face and attempted to do it a third time before I grabbed her hand to prevent her from offending me. She was 5 months pregnant at this point, so I made sure not to use excessive force. Her reaction didn't surprise me because she had been physically aggressive with me a few times in the past, although that had happened years ago. From my experience, she tended to get aggressive when she was at fault or losing an argument. I wrapped both of her hands, turned her around, lifted her, and carried her towards the exit door while she struggled to break free. She was screaming and hurling insults at me, desperate to escape my grip as I escorted her out of the house. I knew the neighbors must have heard the commotion, but I wasn't going to let her stay in the house that night. I gently placed her outside the front door and swiftly locked it behind her before she could regain her footing. She attempted to force the door open, but failed. Seems she went to my neighbor and borrowed a phone. Interestingly, guess who she decided to call? She didn't contact the police, her family, or her friends. Instead, she called that jerk of a patrol partner she had. He showed up at my door with full police authority, tool drawn and all, accompanied by a colleague. The partner seemed to be the more reasonable one among them. They accused me of various things, but, fortunately, I had scars from her offense, and I had taken photos to prove that she was the aggressor. He seemed ready to use lethal force on me, perhaps to clear the path for his extracurricular activities with my wife. She had already fabricated a story, claiming that I had initiated the fight, but she lacked evidence. I had the scars to substantiate my side of the story, yet I still ended up in handcuffs and treated like a criminal in my own home. Then I was asked to vacate my own house, at least for that night. I spent the night at my neighbor's place, still shaken by the rough treatment I had endured. I've decided that I'm definitely going to file a lawsuit, and you won't believe it, he even falsified the domestic incident report. The next morning, I returned to my house. My wife seemed to have come to her senses and was apologizing for what had happened, including her offending me and lying about who had initiated the fight, even though her lies almost ruined me. I explained that it's best for us to separate, at least until she gives birth to the baby. I told her I was leaving, and she expressed concern about who would support her until she could return to work. I suggested that she lean on the lover she had called the day before for support. I moved out of the house the following day, but I told her I'd continue to pay half of the lease since my name is on it. However, I couldn't stay there as a man, knowing that she's involved with another man. She can deny it all she wants, but the truth is crystal clear. Update. 2 days after I separated from my wife, she kept calling me, asking me to return home. I explained that I was out of town for work, and it was best for us to remain separated until the baby is born. My plan was to retrieve my belongings after finishing my current field assignment. During this time, I still answered her phone calls, and we maintained a speaking relationship. We discussed her affair on the phone, but she never admitted to having one. She became angry whenever I brought it up, insisting that she hadn't cheated on me. I lacked concrete evidence to prove her affair, only having my suspicions. She managed to turn our family and friends against me. She proactively presented her case to my parents, claiming that I was abandoning her and spreading lies about her. Consequently, my parents took her side because they wanted to be grandparents. When I shared my suspicions and the fact that she involved her lover in detaining me and kicking me out of my own house, They disregarded it entirely. Then I received a threatening call from her dad. We had never gotten along, so I hung up on him as I'd never liked him, and it seemed the feeling was mutual. We share 3 close mutual friends, and she reached out to them first, crying and emphasizing that she was a pregnant woman. This led them to sympathize with her. Everyone seemed to dismiss my concerns about her affair, believing I was lying, and that she wasn't capable of such actions. I've already spoken to my lawyer to explore my legal options against the police department for the illegal detainment and eviction from my house, despite being the victim. The police officer also filed a false police report against me. Over the next 2 weeks, we had numerous phone conversations, attempting to resolve our issues. She successfully garnered support from everyone, including my parents. I lacked any concrete evidence of her having an affair. All I had were my suspicions. At times, I even began doubting myself. During our separation, my neighbor kept an eye on my wife when he was at home. He mentioned that he never saw a police car around, and my wife rarely left the house except for groceries. I started thinking that maybe I was wrong in accusing her of infidelity. Around a month after our separation, my wife was about 6 months pregnant. We reconciled, and I moved back in with her. It felt like nothing had happened, almost like the good old days. She made every effort to ensure that I didn't suspect anything. However, I wasn't home 100% of the time due to work commitments. I couldn't rely on my neighbor to keep watch constantly since he had his own job. Therefore, I installed several hidden cameras to catch her in the act. These cameras were placed in the bedroom, living room, and driveway. I traveled more that month than ever before, even leaving for an entire week at times, to provide her with the opportunity to cheat. The cameras remained in place for nearly a month, and I diligently reviewed the footage. However, there was no sign of her work partner, and her behavior didn't appear suspicious at all. It seemed like there was nothing to see. I eventually gave up. My suspicions remained, but I had no evidence to support them, and since she wouldn't confess to anything, I had nothing substantial to go on. Skipping the months ahead to when she was approximately 7.5 months pregnant, our troubled past seemed to be a distant memory. During this time, I decided to limit my work-related travel to the local area to spend more time with my wife, who was nearing her due date. I found myself with her more often, and I couldn't help but notice that she was frequently engrossed in texting on her phone. Initially, I assumed it was her friends and family reaching out, so I didn't pay it much attention. However, as it continued, it started to bother me. It reached a point where I couldn't enjoy our time together without her phone constantly buzzing. What struck me as suspicious was how she answered her phone. The way she smiled, chuckled, and tried to hide it, almost as if she didn't want me to notice. I didn't initially think she would be cheating or chatting with another guy given her condition, as she was nearly 8 months pregnant at the time. However, one evening, while we were watching TV, her phone received a text notification. She picked it up and immediately walked into the bathroom, making it glaringly obvious that she was hiding something. I lowered the volume on the TV and approached the bathroom door, hoping to eavesdrop on her conversation, but all I could hear was the sound of her typing away on her phone. It was at that moment when I began to suspect that something was amiss. My wife uses an iPhone with fingerprint verification, and we've never shared our passwords. So I patiently waited for her to fall asleep one night. Once she was asleep, I carefully used her fingers to unlock her phone. Silently, I tiptoed into the bathroom to read her text messages. The last person she had been texting was someone named Sophie. Now, what struck me as strange was that the only text I could see from Sophie was a simple, "Sweet dreams." Innocent, right? But here's the catch. My wife had been in the bathroom texting for a good 30 minutes, and the only visible message was that one phrase from Sophie. The last text message on the caller ID, which was from someone else, dated almost 3 hours ago. So the logical conclusion was that she must have deleted the other messages to hide something. At that moment, my instincts started tingling again, and I felt a sickening sensation in my stomach. I began to suspect that she might be up to her old tricks, or possibly never stopped cheating. Just became more discreet about it. I jotted down Sophie's number and stealthily returned to bed, but I could barely sleep that night. The following day, during my lunch break, I went to a payphone and dialed the number. I had a strong hunch that it belonged to her patrol partner. I pretended to be a utility company and mentioned his name. He confirmed his identity with a simple, "This is me." All my suspicions rushed back, and I realized I wasn't just imagining things. At this point, I didn't have the energy to confront her. I was exhausted, and considering she was due to give birth, I had plans to leave her after the baby arrived. But every time I looked at her with her pregnant belly, I felt a deep attachment and wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. I couldn't understand why she couldn't just remain loyal so that we could create the perfect family. I wanted to have a conversation with her, asking why she continued to chat with this guy, lying and causing me so much pain. I was visibly depressed and anxious, especially with the baby on the way. A few months later, she gave birth to a baby boy. It never crossed my mind that the baby might not be mine. I thought he looked more like her, but at that age, it's tough to tell. Anyone's guess, really. After she was discharged from the hospital, I waited a few days before confronting her about the text messages. She claimed it was just a female friend of hers. But then I told her I had called the number, and her patrol partner had answered. She denied it, so I suggested we open the text and dial the number on speakerphone. She refused, and that was the final straw for me. I expressed my frustration and told her I was moving out again. She pleaded with me, finally admitting that it was her co-worker. She explained she'd hidden his number because he kept texting her, and she didn't want to seem ungrateful by ignoring him. She knew I'd be upset if I found out, which is why she'd used a fake name. I insisted that she quit her job as a police officer and find another one, and she agreed. I also asked her to block his number and cut off contact with him, which she did right in front of me. I wasn't naive. I knew she could unblock it and continue the affair in secret. But it seemed like she was trying to make things right and keep me from leaving. Things went smoothly with no major issues. Both our families came to celebrate the arrival of the baby. We even started looking for houses to buy because we were renting at the time. I began traveling more for work to save money for a down payment. With a baby and an unemployed wife, it wasn't exactly cheap. I was excited to be a new father. My wife wanted to take some time off work to spend with the baby, and I agreed. I preferred her looking after the baby rather than sending him to daycare or hiring a babysitter, at least until he got a bit older. Moving ahead a few months during my field assignments, I noticed something unsettling. There were times when I called her, but she wouldn't answer or return my calls. Even in the evenings when she should have been home, she wouldn't pick up her phone. It struck me as odd because she was not working, and her primary responsibility was taking care of our baby. When I discussed this with my neighbor, he informed me that my wife often spent most nights away from home when I was gone. I began to suspect she might be up to something, and I knew she wouldn't confess unless I had concrete evidence. So when I returned home that week, I decided to take action. I purchased a GPS device and discreetly installed it in her car. My intention was to find out where she was taking our child when I was away and why she was ignoring my calls for extended periods, as well as her unexplained absences. I spoke to my boss and requested local assignments for the rest of the month to allow me to monitor the GPS closely. To cover my intentions, I told my wife that I would be traveling out of state so I could secretly follow her wherever she went when I wasn't home. Lo and behold, on the same day that I pretended to be heading out of state, that evening she drove to an unfamiliar apartment complex. It had a gated entrance, and I couldn't enter until another car opened the gate. Once inside, I parked my car a few spaces away from hers. She had already left her vehicle and entered one of the units in the apartment building. I hadn't witnessed which specific unit she entered, so I patiently waited outside. To test her honesty, I devised a plan. I decided to call her and ask about her whereabouts. I phoned her while she was inside the apartment, but she didn't answer. However, about 30 minutes later, she returned the call. I inquired why it had taken her so long to answer, and she claimed she had been tending to the baby. I pointed out that there was a lot of background noise and casually asked if she was at home, all in an attempt to see if she would be truthful. She responded by insisting that she was indeed at home. I then informed her that I was currently at the airport. My work had wrapped up earlier than expected, and I'd be home in about an hour. She was taken aback and stumbled over her words. I asked what was troubling her, and she struggled to explain, saying she wasn't prepared for my early return and needed to tidy up and get things ready. Perplexed, I questioned what she meant by preparing things. Her responses only added to her confusion, and it became evident that she had been caught. She abruptly ended the call, promising to get back to me once my flight landed. Roughly 10 minutes later, I observed her hastily leaving the apartment. In one hand, she carried the baby swing, and in the other, my baby bag. But who was behind her, carrying the baby as though he were the father? She opened the SUV's trunk, and her patrol partner stood right behind her. Clearly, she hadn't maintained no contact and hadn't blocked his number. He held the baby as if he were its father. This man had his own family with 3 children and a suburban home with them. It seemed they'd rented an apartment just to rendezvous. Nevertheless, my suspicions deepened. The way he carried the baby suggested that I might not be the father. I couldn't restrain myself. I immediately exited my car and confronted them. They both looked stunned to see me there. I informed her that there was no need for her to return home, that I'd caught them red-handed and they could stay in their little apartment. She didn't offer an apology or any explanation. Instead, she hurried into her car, knowing they'd been exposed, and they sped out of the apartment parking lot. I promptly got into my car and called her father, informing him of the incident. I told him to his face that his daughter was promiscuous, just as I had predicted. I expressed my doubts about the child's paternity and my intent to get a DNA test. I let him know that the baby likely belonged to a man who was already married with 3 children. I'll admit I lost my composure, but I don't regret it. This woman has been toying with me for years, constantly lying and manipulating. I've exposed them and flushed them out of their hiding spot like rats. If she didn't want to be with me, why didn't she just leave me alone during our separation? Why manipulate me and everyone around me to reconcile? When I returned home, she wasn't there, as expected. The next day, she called me in tears, insisting she hadn't done anything wrong. She said she needed to return home because of the baby, citing that baby supplies like food, bottles, and clothes were at the house. She claimed to feel restless, and the baby had been crying. I told her she was free to come back, but I was leaving because I had doubts about the baby's paternity and was pursuing a divorce for good this time. She insisted the baby was mine, warning that I'd regret denying it. I countered that we needed a DNA test to confirm paternity, highlighting that she obviously hadn't blocked her former patrol partner, making it impossible for me to believe there was nothing between them. She returned home with one of her female friends, apparently fearing my reaction. She knew bringing her former patrol partner would only escalate things. That day, I ordered a DNA kit online and had it overnighted. I refused to speak to her because I was emotionally invested. I'd provided everything for this baby, so I knew I might become emotional and tearful if I tried to communicate. It was challenging for me to accept the possibility that the child might not be mine. When the DNA test kit arrived, I struggled to find an opportunity to get a swab from the baby, as my wife was always with them. Her friend had left by then because she realized I wasn't a threat. It took until the 3rd day for us to start talking, and I initiated the conversation solely to gain her consent to hold the baby, even if it was just for one last time. I truly cared for the child and wanted to be a father. At the time, I wished the baby was mine, and I hoped the DNA test would confirm it. I eventually managed to discreetly collect a genetic sample and sent it for testing without my wife's knowledge. When the results came in, I was working in another part of the city. I had the chance to view the results online, and regrettably, it indicated that the baby wasn't mine. I shared the results with my parents, partly to show them they had been wrong to doubt me. But deep down, I wished I had been mistaken. I also sent the results to her father as a reminder that his daughter had behaved poorly. My wife was the last to receive the results, and she didn't receive them from me. After all she had put me through, she must have suspected the truth. We didn't have any joint property, so the divorce shouldn't be drawn out. According to the law, I'm considered the presumed father because I was married to the child's mother when the baby was born. I'll need to go through the courts to end the legal parent-child relationship, support obligations, and terminate the marriage. I've contacted a divorce lawyer to ensure the process with my wife is initiated as swiftly as possible. Update. It's been 14 months since I divorced my unfaithful wife, and a lot has occurred during that time. I decided to leave the city where I grew up because I was constantly being chased by the police. I had filed complaints twice, sued them twice, and won one case, but the stalking persisted. So, I chose to move out of town. I often travel for work, and I wanted to reside in the countryside since I enjoy hunting and camping. Since I'm away for work half the time, my exact location doesn't matter much to me. Additionally, I purchased acres of land for hunting and camping during my downtime when I'm not traveling for work. What unfolded after my wife was served divorce papers at our home while I was out of town was utter chaos. She kept trying to call me, but I refused to answer her calls. 2 days after she was served, I returned home with a U-Haul to collect my belongings. She was present when I arrived and attempted to prevent me from leaving, but I only took what was rightfully mine and left behind anything we had shared. She understood that I was finished with the marriage, and everyone now knew her true character. She couldn't manipulate those around me and our friends any longer because they had all seen the DNA test results. After I finished packing my things and before leaving our shared home for the last time, I asked my now ex-wife to allow me to hold the baby one last time, and she agreed. I genuinely wished I was the father, and I loved the child. When she saw me holding the baby, she began to cry and apologized for everything. I promptly returned the baby to her because I was also on the verge of tears, and I didn't want her to witness my emotional breakdown. I moved in with my parents since I couldn't find a place I liked. My plan was to stay with my parents, continue saving money, and that was before I relocated to the countryside where I purchased a large tract of land. This land even has its own small lake, offering me the opportunity to hunt and camp on my property when I'm not traveling the country for work. I spend most of my time on the road, embracing a nomadic lifestyle. However, when I return home, I find solace in the peaceful place I can truly call my own. I still can't help but feel that the only people suffering through all of this are me, my ex-wife, and the innocent baby, while her affair partner seems to escape unscathed. Even though I can't say with certainty that he's the baby's father, all the circumstantial evidence points in his direction. They've been working together for over a year, seeing each other for almost 2 years, and the neighbor even caught him coming to my house, presumably to be with my wife. They got exposed, and he even rented an apartment to meet up with my wife. I gathered all the evidence, including the DNA result, to expose him. I wanted to send it to his wife, so I subscribed to a paid service to locate where he lived and identify his wife. I found his home in the suburbs, waited until I was sure he had left for work, and his wife was home, and then I delivered the package. Then one evening, while returning from a friend's house, I got pulled over by a cop. I wasn't speeding or breaking any laws, so I was curious about why he stopped me. I initially thought it might have been my ex-wife's affair partner, but it turned out to be someone I hadn't seen before. I hadn't been stopped by a cop in years, so this felt very random to me. He claimed I was going 10 miles above the speed limit, and I disputed his claim. Nevertheless, he gave me a ticket, saying I should appear in court, etc. Well, if you're familiar with the court system, you know that disputing a ticket can end up costing more, so I chose to accept the ticket and attend defensive driving to remove it from my record. It seemed like a minor annoyance in the grand scheme of things. Less than a week after I got the first speeding ticket, I received another one for speeding, even though I knew I wasn't actually speeding. It felt more like a police chase targeting me. This time